All right, wonderful. It looks like everything is working. Welcome to everybody joining us tonight on this seventh session of our course on the history of Zionism. It's good to have all of you here. Whether you are right here with me on Zoom attending live or you're watching this whenever you're going to be watching this, we're going to leave this available for free to everyone until forevermore. So you may be watching this some years past, and it's good to have you here. We're connected through time. We're going to start tonight, as we always do, with a short meditation and a shalom chant. I invite you to find a comfortable sitting position and to close your eyes. And just find your breath gently and let your body relax. Inviting into our space, into this moment that connects us through space and time. Energies of peace and wholeness, of harmony. Three translations of the word shalom. יהיו לרצון אמרתי והגיון ליבי לפניך, אדוני. Holy One of all being, help us to know your presence in this moment. That the words of our mouth, the meditations of our hearts might always flow unencumbered from the ground of your being. Adonai Tzuri v'Goali. Holy One, help me to remember that you are that which shape this form of mind, and you are that which liberates us. Amen. All right, so we are session 7, meaning that we are halfway there. There will be a midterm at the end of this session, so I hope you all have your number 2 pencil sharpened. Here we go. As always, we have a lot to cover tonight, so I'm going to jump in immediately and see where we go with this. So, where do things stand by the time the League of Nations awards Britain with the mandate over Palestine in the year 1922? Almost exactly 100 years ago. Now remember, in 1921, just a few months before, Faisal from the Hashemite dynasty, King Hussein of Arabia, Faisal was installed by Britain as king of Iraq, and his brother Abdullah as king of what was called at the time Transjordan. Simply Jordan today, actually. And then we had Churchill's white papers that dealt a real blow, if you remember, to the Zionist aspirations, because it shrunk what was known as Palestine in half. And we will see in just a few years from today, from now, now in the unfolding of our history, not today, but a few years beyond the mandate, this splitting of Palestine into two will have actually dire consequences, as in no small ways we will see that it torpedoed the possibility of a solution in the conflict between the Jews and the Arabs some years later. But obviously, at the time, they had no way of knowing that. It just complicated things down the road. But we'll see that in, I think, the next session. The other thing that the white papers did was to restrict Jewish immigration. And Samuel, Sir Herbert Samuel, following the riots in Jaffa, himself responded by closing the port to Jewish immigration for several months, and in doing so, rewarding Arab violence, right? Because all of this happened after the riots, rewarding Arab violence not only with British concessions, such as the white papers, but also with the reaction of Samuel in the land itself. And in doing so, they will set a precedent, if you'd like, that will actually historically be repeated, because it will become a common feature of the British Mandate, setting a precedent for the Arabs who understood that violence against the Jews was rewarded by having access, or having their demands, in fact, eventually met. So in 1922, as the British Mandate begins, the Jewish prospects in the land already look less than promising. At the same time, and I think I acknowledged that in the previous session, and I hope that you learned much more about it through the assigned readings this week. I know there was a lot. But Samuel, if you saw, at the same time, begins to heavily invest Britain and Britain capital in building the necessary infrastructure that will, in fact, allow for a future state to be literally built upon. What he is setting in motion, and they're being very successful in doing, will actually be the ground for the creation of a future state, thanks to all the infrastructure that is putting in place. At the time, the Arab population had a clear 80% majority in the land, and the Jewish population was at about 15%. And then another census is taken that reveals some 800,000 people living west of the Jordan River, right? Between, I think, 650,000 Arabs, if I remember correctly, 75,000 Christians, and about 80,000 Jews. So roughly 800,000 people living west of the Jordan in the early years of the 1920s. To compare with today, the population west of the Jordan in the same area is 15 million people. So in 100 years, we went from 800,000 people, short of a million, to 15 million people living together west of the Jordan River. And actually, Jewish and Arab population are almost exactly half and half. There are about 7.2, 7.5 million Jewish inhabitants in the land of Israel, and 2 million Arab Israelis also living in the land of Israel, in the state of Israel, and another 5.5 million Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza. So 15 million people evenly divided between Jews and Arabs. But a huge jump, as you can see, from in 100 years, from 800,000 to 15 million, all in the same space, all in the same space. Some actually are starting to say that it feels that the land west of the Jordan is at the risk now of burdening their natural resources so much that there's questions about sustainability, even in with climate change and the scarcity of water resources. It's become quite of an issue that politically is being looked at, of course. Politically, as we've seen, back on on the history side, politically, as we've seen, despite his multiple attempts at creating a kind of an interfaith governing body in Palestine, the Arab have repeatedly rejected Herbert Samuel's invitations to participate politically in the governing of the land, which has pushed Samuel to eventually, after so many rejections of so many offerings that he had, to resort to a quasi colonial rule over Palestine. Like he had no other choice. And in a way, the Arabs' unwillingness to participate in any kind of self-government might have been a blessing for the Jewish endeavor that actually the Arabs, we understand now, opposed. Because we can imagine that with such an overwhelming majority, 80% majority in the land, had they participated in a democratic government in the land, they would have commanded such a majority in every election that they would have been able to severely curtail, if not altogether eliminate, Jewish immigration. And they could have easily nip any possibility of a Jewish state right in the bud, right there and then. But they rejected those offerings, they rejected those propositions, and in fact set themselves up in this black and white, all or nothing proposition that, if we'll see as the history unfolds, will backfire against their own aspirations. They didn't understand what was at stake, and they just flatly rejected everything. And I'm hoping that I'll start to create really a picture of I did that with a Jewish first aliyot, but to try to really get a picture of where both sides really stand, how they understand themselves in the context, and what are the chess moves they are making that eventually are going to allow history to unfold the way it does. A lot of historians believe that these rejections, right at the beginning of the mandate of the Arabs to step in and take really leadership, obviously in parallel with the British mandate, it's not like they would have run the country, was a strategic mistake, was a real strategic mistake for them, for their ambitions, and for their agenda. Someone asked me in an email this week, why did the Arab leadership fail to understand this seemingly easy concept and reject Samuel's offers? And I don't want to answer this question right away because I think I'm building a case through the course, and I'd like, I always want to invite you to reflect on what is going on, who is making what decisions, and how we continue to get where we eventually are. It feels unavoidably getting because of all of the cascading decisions that are made in the moment. But to try to feel underneath that, like, why were they thinking the way they were thinking? What was their worldview? How did they relate to the events that were going on that pushed them to act in that way? If you could keep asking yourself this question, then you can start. I'm hinting at it here and there, but you can start to get a sense of the deeper motivations or deeper fears or the mistaken worldviews that each side actually is holding that is pitting them against each other. Anyways, I was also reminded of Abba Eban. I don't know, some of us maybe date ourselves, but he was, legendary Israeli diplomat, obviously well versed in Jewish Arab history, Jewish Arab conflict. And he said in 1973, a very famous sentence. He said, "The Arabs never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity." And we will see this play out over and over again. And I think to this very day, we will see it in all the proposals over the many, many proposals that were placed in front of them for an independent state during the British Mandate, following the British Mandate. And over again, they're going to have the same stand as they are having right now with Herbert Samuel and his offering. They're going to keep on rejecting. But that's not interesting if we are not trying to understand what's underneath that. But we'll definitely come back to Abba Ibn sentence. The Arabs never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. But even without the support from the overwhelming Arab majority in the land, the British move forward and create, as we see, a robust, and independent judiciary branch of government, as well as a very efficient bureaucracy, and continue to invest in public works. Their puzzle, the puzzle they were trying to solve, however, was how to reconcile their mandate to bring about their commitment to create a Jewish national home in this now shrunken territory, when on the other side, the leadership of the country, the overwhelming majority of the country, 80% of the population opposes it. Right? That's their conundrum. That's what they're trying to solve. How can we make good on the Balfour Declaration? How can we make good on our promise to the Jews while at the same time, honoring 80% of the population that lives here and opposes it, right? And this clear opposition between the two population push both Jews and Arabs to really create and grow separately, separate societies, really. They create separate economies, separate school systems, and they create, each of them, separate governments in parallel to the British Mandate as well. And we see immediately after the Jaffa riots of 1921 that Jews become really afraid at that point to live in mixed cities and towns. And so we see most of the Jews of Jaffa leave, and they move just a little bit north of Jaffa. And they're going to help this very little city that was founded just a decade before, called Tel Aviv. They're going to help move by moving there. They're going to help really make Tel Aviv the little village that that could and really is going to be the seed of a future of what Tel Aviv will become. Which, if you've never been to Tel Aviv, imagine Miami. That's today Tel Aviv. So literally from a bunch of sand dunes in front of the Mediterranean Sea to Miami in 100 years. Quite astonishing what happened there. Now, the one aspect that I left out of our last session that is important for me to mention now, I left it out because there was already too much to try to digest last time, but I can't escape bringing it up now, is that between 1918, so after the end of the First World War, and 1922, we have the third Aliyah, the third wave of immigration. Now, I mentioned that the census showed some 87,000 Jews living in the land in the early 1920s, 85,000. And we know that that's an increase of 37,000 from the end of 1918. If you remember, at the end of the war, there barely is 50,000 Jews left in the Promised Land. 37,000 Jews will come between 1918 and 1922 at the time of the census. And they mostly came from the Pale of Settlement, once again, Eastern Europe, Western Russia. Why such a sudden, sharp increase? I mean, from 50 to 87, that's a huge jump, right? And the answer remains the same. I know it feels like a broken record, but it's incredible to see what happened to Russian Jews, Eastern European Jews, between 1881 and basically 1921, right? Over 40 years. More and more and more pogroms. Now, you would think that with the Tsar out of the picture after the Bolshevik Revolution in November 1917, they would be too busy building a communist regime to have to deal with the Jews. But that's not actually what happens. After the revolution, Russia devolves into a prolonged civil war. And that civil war will last until about mid-1923. And as always, the Jews were caught in the middle, and devastating waves of massacres engulfed the Jewish community altogether. It took place mostly in today's Ukraine, but it also spilled out much beyond this area of the Pale of Settlement. And it unfolded mostly, not just only, but mostly over 2 years between 1918 and 1920. And both sides of the civil war in Russia had their hand in the Jewish massacres. Scholars and historians have numbered the pogroms to be between 1,500 to 2,000. I mean, can you imagine? Like, there were so many pogroms over just 2 years that, I mean, it's very sad to say, but it became part of Jewish life. Like, it became just a unknown, right? 15, if it only was 1500, let's say, let's not even go for 2000, but over 2 years. I mean, that's you can divide 1500 by 24 and you'll see how many pogroms a month there appeared. I haven't done the math, but I'm sure you can. Those pogroms unfolded in 1,300 different places, 1,300 different shtetls, Jewish localities, or simply towns and villages. By the time the dust settles, and I want you to really listen to this, up to it is accounted that about 250,000 Jews 250,000 Jews are found murdered. Like that's 250,000 who are murdered over 2 years. We have accounts of about 300 children who are orphaned. 500,000 are left, 500,000 left the Pale of Settlement or were driven out of their homes. All told, we know that about 1 million Jews were affected one way or another by the multiple year massacres, losing property, loved ones, obviously also losing their own lives. Now, if you have the stomach to read about this, if you want to learn more about it, and I venture that maybe some of you have family who arrived in the US in the 1920s, so that may be part of your history. If you are interested, first of all, I would suggest that you start with, in fact, the Wikipedia entry. This is not a very scholarly thing to do, but it's always there and available. And just search pogroms during the Russian Civil War. Just do that search in Wikipedia, and you'll have too much information that you probably need. But if you want a more scholarly account, there is a book that actually the Wikipedia entry references throughout called Russian Jews Between the Red and the Whites, which were the two sides of the Civil War. Russian Jews Between the Red and the Whites, 1917-1920. A book written by Oleg Budnitsky, Budnitskii. Oleg Budnitsky, Russian Jews Between the Red and the Whites, 1917-1920. Obviously, I don't have time to, dwell into that. Maybe a different class for another time. But to me, it's really important because, Israeli Jews are the Jews of history, right? They brought with them history to the land. And that's, as I share with you all of this, again, those are little hints and pieces to file in the back of your mind to try to really understand, to really understand today. Israeli Jews are really the Jews of history, like no other people probably are on this planet. And this aliyah, this third aliyah, 37,000 Jews arrive. Again, I repeat myself, not as colonial conquering forces, but as absolutely devastated refugees who have lost everything, probably lost everyone, and are just trying to find a place of refuge in a world that has rejected them. Again, I know that I also said that before, but it's always good also to remember what the word looked like for the Jews prior to the existence of the state of Israel, how utterly at the mercy of their neighbors, and pogroms often are at the hands of your neighbors, how utterly at the mercy of our neighbors we lived. It is this third aliyah, together with the second one, that will define what the state of Israel will eventually become, which is at the outset a completely Jewish secular state based on socialist principles. It's hard for us maybe to understand that, but that's really how the founding of the state emerged. It was to be a Jewish state, but a completely secular state based on socialist principles. Um, and that's something we need to keep in mind as well. This is not a Jewish religious state, even if it calls itself Jewish, because Jewish identity is not uh, encapsulated by just the religious practice. That's not what being Jewish is. Being Jewish is not what religion you practice. There are many Jews that don't practice any religion, many Jews that practice all kinds of religions. That doesn't mean they're not Jewish. It's very different, and maybe it throws people off because we don't really understand the uniqueness of the nation of Israel, of the Jewish nation. So the Jews of the third Aliyah were even more committed to the ethics of the socialist ethics of the second Aliyah. They were even more committed to the project of rebuilding themselves and the country through establishing socialist farms, draining swamps, and building roads. But unlike their predecessor, they were a little smarter, but they had time and they learned from everybody else's mistake. They actually trained themselves in the Pale of Settlement prior to emigrating to Palestine, and therefore they came better prepared, better equipped to face the harshness of life in the Middle East. And though I mentioned before, a few of those collective farms had already been created by pioneers during the second Aliyah, it was really the newcomers of the third Aliyah that are credited for founding the socialist communes that are known as the kibbutz movement, right? The kibbutz movement is born 100 years ago, mostly from the third Aliyah. The same kibbutz of very lefty socialist believers to this day, the same kibbutz that are really the far left, I would say, of Israeli politics to this day, that are the peaceniks, that are those who reach out to the Arab population, the very ultra leftist peacenik Israelis that were attacked and massacred on October 7th, which adds insult to injury as far as we're concerned. Now, you will see Sachar's description of kibbutz life in the reading excerpts for this session. I'm not going to get into those details. He's doing it for me, and I appreciate him. That being said, having lived on a kibbutz for a summer in my youth, I was very attracted actually by this kind of lifestyle. I don't think Sachar in his description really captures how really rewarding, even really transformative living in a kibbutz can be. I think for these new immigrants, like 100 years ago, living this way after running away from the violence they were running away from, living this way was probably very cathartic for them. I would say even maybe healing, cleansing. They left the diaspora, they left, that was pain and violence and blood and hardship. And this started again in the land, in the land of Israel, as far as they understood it. And they created communal life, a life where everybody helped everybody, out of nothing, really from nothing. And they lived also, for those of you who have been, even as we toured Israel the many times that I took groups, they lived surrounded by the awe-inspiring beauty of Israel every day. I can't imagine waking up after having lived what they have lived through, waking up in the kibbutz, in in the Galilee in northern Israel. For those of you who know that part of Israel, it must have been so awe-inspiring and such a place to heal, such a place to rebuild yourself. And that's what they did. They really transformed themselves and they transformed the land as well. And their children, we don't think about this, but oftentimes just a few years after they arrived, 3, 4 years, they started to have children who were born there. And these children who were born and raised there in the 30s, right? They didn't have the baggage that their parents had. They learned Hebrew, these children, and they worked alongside their their parents and grandparents. And as they did, they also hiked this country and felt the yearning to defend it, to protect it. And it was a land that they were taught was their birthright, was their birthright from the suffering of their ancestors. In parallel to the kibbutz movement, there is another form of collective farming that is being developed at the time, also in the 1920s, that is called a moshav. So there were kibbutz and moshav, and the principles are roughly the same, except that in a moshav, you can raise your children in your home. You have a dedicated home for you and your family, and you could maintain some of what we are accustomed to as being a private lifestyle. In the kibbutz, you don't raise your own children. The kibbutz raises your children. So children are born, and after a little while, they are dropped off, if you want, in the shared communal place where all the kids grow up together. And the members of the kibbutz, the adults, take turn. Some specialize in, education and nurturing of children, but also, all the parents, everybody in the kibbutz volunteers to raise the children. But you don't have, or you rarely have, your children with you. You may have them maybe for vacation or for the holidays or something like that, but the kibbutz raises your children. We always say it takes a village to raise children. Well, in the kibbutz context, that's exactly what they did. But even though I'm talking a lot about the kibbutz and the moshav, both of those movements really only accounted for about 5% of the total Jewish population at the time. Even though, as we know, in the 1920s, about a third of the Jews worked in agriculture. Only 5% of the Jews worked either or lived either in a moshav or a kibbutz. I also want to talk, I think I'm cramming two aliyot at the same time tonight, but here we are because that is also relevant to the second half of the 1920s now. You realize that for once, I'm actually covering more than just 2 or 3 years of the history. I'm almost going to get to 8, 6, 7, maybe 8 years. We'll see. But we have to talk as well about the fourth aliyah. There's going to be altogether 5. So we're almost there. But the fourth aliyah, I want to mention it because it's not really mentioned much anywhere. As you read Sachar, this upcoming session, he only has about 2 pages in his entire book. And if you have the book, It's a big book. But he has 2 pages dedicated to the fourth Aliyah. And not that I am offended, but I have, somewhat of a stake in the fourth Aliyah because it's a little bit of the story of my own family. So I want to, bear with me. I want to indulge a little bit in describing the fourth Aliyah. The fourth Aliyah happens between 1924 and 1928. And this one brings about 80,000 Jews. So it's the biggest wave of immigration to date, right? 80,000 Jews. About 70,000 of them come from Poland, and the rest from different other countries. Maybe you'll see a little bit of that in Sachar, but 70 out of 80,000 come from Poland. So what was going on in Poland at that time that pushed so many Jews to leave? Now, Poland, over the centuries, has appeared and disappeared from European maps. And after the Treaty of Versailles, at the end of the First World War, this is when Poland reappears on the map, because prior to that, it was overtaken by the German, the Austro-Hungarian, and the Russian empires that had conquered parts of it. And after the defeat of Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Russia being at war with itself, Poland suddenly reappears on the map. But it reappears on the map in the wake of this rampant anti-Semitism that we have seen, and I just described, from the Russian Civil War. And, it's not because the Russian Civil War is over in 1923 that anti-Semitism dies with it. In fact, it kind of walked it up, if you want. So I can't really go into the details of Polish history at the time, but let's just say that the early years of this new or renewed country are also marked by war. Maybe because he wanted to solidify its borders, there is a war between Poland and Ukraine in the southern part of its borders, and there is a war between Poland and Lithuania in the northern border. And in the meantime, there is a major economic crisis that hits Poland in 1924. So here we are. There is kind of a piling up of historical events, right? Ramping anti-Semitism, unabating anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, wars, economic devastation. All of this is really enough for thousands of Jews to pack and leave. Now, why so many Jews decide to immigrate to Israel when in the previous Aliyot, we've seen that overwhelmingly the Jews moved to America? Well, there's a problem with America, and a problem that is going to have real dire consequences in the years that are going to follow. Because in the 1920s, America's consciousness is shifting with regards to Jewish, specifically Jewish immigration. In 1921, the US government passes the Emergency Quota Act, followed by the 1924 Immigration Act that places heavy restrictions on Jewish immigration at that time. Why? I guess anti-Semitism was really everywhere. Again, I don't have time to go into American history, but I'm sure it is available to us as to why Congress decided to almost stop Jewish immigration at that time. And it's going to get worse in the 1930s, really just at the wrong time, as we will see. But as a result, Jews could not leave for America. Many Jews left from Western Europe, which is what my grandmother's family did. And they came to France, which is the reason why I was born there. And as we see, 70,000 of them moved to Palestine. Now, this aliyah was different than all the previous aliyot. Why? Because Polish Jews were not socialists. Not at all. They were overwhelmingly middle-class families that were engaged in business and commerce, that were leaders of industry, and they came to the land completely uninterested in farming, but instead in opening businesses there, to open shops, retail establishment. And they move not to the farmlands, but they move to Tel Aviv. They move to Haifa. They move to Jerusalem. And so with their arrival, Tel Aviv's population triples. 46,000 Jews are now in Tel Aviv by the second half of the 1920s. One can even say that these Jews were not really Zionists. They didn't really have any, pioneering fervor in them. Not at all. They came really as refugees once again. They came as refugees because of anti-Semitism, refugees because of economic reasons. They didn't really, most of them didn't have an ounce of Zionism or nationalism in them. There was a Jewish community that was growing in the land of Palestine, and they decided to take their chance there. And so they arrived there, they set up shop, literally, and they helped really build up the economy, the Jewish economy, not just the Jewish economy, but the economy in the entire land. They set up the early industrial infrastructure that will eventually be the foundation, the industrial foundation of the state of Israel. And with that, we can't also not ignore that the 1920s were economically very difficult years in Palestine. There was high unemployment. There was great hunger. There was hunger following the war, but the war too, if you remember. Those were the decade of mid-World War to mid-1920s, even late 1920s, was economically difficult in the land. In fact, all told, if we look at all the different waves of people who are going to come through that fourth aliyah, if we were to really add up all the numbers, one might say that there is almost as much, maybe less, but barely less Jews that left after coming than those who stayed. So the population grew, of course, but not exponentially, because it was so hard to be there. What happened with those who were able to stay against all odds is that they continued to build the country brick by brick, really. And what might have helped actually is the fact that after the Jaffa riots of 1921, the country was pretty quiet for the following 8 years. And so that, maybe because there was so much hunger and poverty, maybe there was really no appetite for, pun non intended, for rioting or violence on the side of the Arabs. But really, it was a quiet time. It was really a time of building. Like I said, um, you know, each side was building their economy. Each side was building their socio-economic structures, their self-government. So, maybe they didn't have much time for anything else. So, yes, the Jewish population slowly expanded for sure, but the Arab population grew at an incredibly faster rate. Remember, 650,000 in 1922. 9 years later, in 1931, almost 850,000. So 250,000 growth in the Arab population. Why? So good. This is a good place to rewind the movie reel of history and plant our camera to kind of zoom in on the Arab population and have an understanding of what's going on there, that it is growing at this such a fast clip. The Arab population really didn't pay much heed to the few thousand, mostly religious Jews of the first Aliyah who came. Right? We've seen tension escalating, but that really was against the more like socialist immigration of the second Aliyah, right? What really bring things to a boil, right? Really happened after the failed revolution, the failed communist revolt in Russia in 1905, because we also have to remember that the Ottoman Empire had been at war with Tsarist Russia for a long time. They were competing with southeast territories of Europe. And so the Ottoman Empire and Russia had been at war for a while. And the Arab elite of Palestine was empowered, and because they were literally put in positions of power and enriched, made wealthy by serving the Ottoman Sultan's rule over their territory. Right? That's very important to understand. So let me restate this. The Arab elites who live in Palestine before the Bolshevik Revolution, before World War I, are Ottoman citizens. They are Ottoman citizens who, because they are the elite, the biggest families, or the most powerful families at the time, wealthy farmers, they also become the rulers on behalf of the Ottoman Empire of the populations of Palestine, right? So they had a real allegiance to the Ottoman Empire, right? The Ottoman Empire over the generations had made them the ruling elite in the land. So they had great allegiance to the Ottoman Empire, which makes sense. Now, the Ottoman Empire has been at war with Russia for a long time. So, as an Ottoman autocrat, as an Ottoman servant of the Sultan, you have learned to despise the Russians. Make sense? Now here are all of these Jews who are coming from Russia. And some scholars are actually saying that the animosity of the Arab elite in Palestine originally had very little to do with the fact that these were Jews. Because again, the first Aliyah, they were religious Jews. Even though they came from Russia, they didn't really pay much attention to them. There were too few of them. They were too poor, and they went to the holy cities. But they are starting to look at all of these Russian Jews, these Russian folks, right, who are suddenly arriving in the land. And so we may wonder that maybe it was more their Russian provenance than their Jewishness that bothered them, right? And so that's where they start to really pay attention to these Jews who arrive from the Pale of Settlement, from Russia. And they watch them carefully, and they really listen to what they are saying. And because maybe they're spies, or maybe they're like a fifth column, right? That's really, there is a part of the Arab elite especially that might have looked at the Jews in this kind of a way, right? And so they listen. And the Zionists, Jews, the spokesmen, the ones who wrote in the new, the first Jewish newspapers there, they rarely spoke of, I mentioned that before, but they rarely spoke of any nationalism, because it wasn't something you would do under Ottoman rule. But it was still clear that as they published stories, or dialogue between themselves, or some Zionists spoke at a meeting, a convention, a public square, whatever, they started, they could hear that they wanted to establish a Jewish home in the region. And so they wondered, how could these few thousand people think that it could be possible, right? Talking about the early 1900s, how could these few thousand Jews who are here, how can they be talking this way? How can they be writing about this? How would they ever achieve the majority of the population that they would need in order to enable them to establish a Jewish home, a state, right? They started to think to themselves, either they would need to really enact a massive program of immigration, which in the 1900s, early 1900s, that was nowhere to be seen, or they would need to displace the Arab population, or maybe even both. And that was just not fathomable, unless maybe Russia was behind it all. And if that was the case, then conflict was probably unavoidable. So I want you to store this information, because it will become really crucial to understand the mentality of the Arab, especially the Arab elite, as the story unfolds. Now, the Jews were here. Just a few thousands of them, 50,000 by World War I. And they were investing massive capital into Palestine. And so Arabs, after, especially after the third Aliyah and then the fourth Aliyah, Arabs from surrounding vilayates, this Muslim regions, right? We talked about the vilayet of Damascus, the vilayet of Aleppo, right? those large regions, they come to Palestine. They don't live in Palestine. They live far away, far beyond, but they hear that the economy is not doing bad compared to where they are in the vilayet, in the place of Palestine, and so they move. There's employment opportunities there, right? I mentioned, you know, the kibbutz and the moshav, but that's just 5% of the total yishuv, of the total Jewish community by the 1920s. Let's not forget the earlier capitalist farms of the first Aliyah, who still exist, who still employ large number of Arabs. And with the mandate, the British also, in their effort to build the state, all their projects of infrastructure and so on, they also need to employ people. And so they employ a lot of Arabs. And so the economy of Palestine, I wouldn't say was booming, because we know that it wasn't. There was a lot of difficulties. But when compared to the surrounding Arab states, they were paradoxically in a much better shape. And so you have immigration, Arab immigration, to not just to Palestine, but to areas of Jewish concentration. And so their population numbers is growing faster than than you can see definitely the Jewish population growing, mostly due to this immigration. And so, just perhaps as the Arab elite believe Russia to have sponsored Russian Jewish immigration to Palestine, so do they begin to believe with the British mandate that Britain was the new patron of and behind the Jewish project, especially after the Balfour Declaration and the beginning of the mandate. Do you see what I'm trying to say here? Is that the Arab elite first saw Russia as the backers of this Jewish immigration. Now the British Empire is here. Oh, now these Zionists, have the backing. They have a new patron. That's a very interesting word, a new patron that is there to help them, achieve their aims, their vision for the promised land. So those Jews first were, from the colonialist empire, Russian Empire. Now their new patron are the colonial empire of Britain. Right? I'm using these words on purpose because I'm trying to hint at how the Arab elite begins to see. We'll see why later, but how they begin to see this, right? So the impetus to collaborate, you can understand now that the impetus to collaborate with the Jews in the early years of the mandate, as we've seen, just wasn't going to be in the cards for them. It was never going to happen because of how they viewed what was happening in the land. To add to this, and I know I mentioned it earlier, Arab elites distrust the invading Christian infidels and saw them as the colonial arm of the Jewish project, as if the Zionists had the entire British Empire in their back pocket. As for the Jews, even when Palestinian Arabs asked the Jews to forego the British mandate and deal with them people to people, you'll see that the Jewish leadership never ever takes the bait. They strategized by bypassing the British forces. Um, Let me rephrase that. They understood what, or they believed they understood what the Arabs were trying to do. Because the Arab made an offer. So let me backtrack a little bit because I think it's important. There was a time where the Arab leadership made an offer to the Zionist leadership and said, look, we don't need Britain to be in between us. Why don't the two of us, right? Why don't we, Arab and Jews, just decide that, we're going to take care of everything here. We are here. We live here. It's our place. Why should we need the British powers to rule over us both? We can do it. We can do it by ourselves. The Zionist leadership was very weary of that. They thought that if they were to agree to the proposal from the Arab elite and bypass the British forces that protected them, it would leave them isolated, alone, to have to fend off the Arabs who, they knew, because that had been the case in the years of the Ottoman Empire, really considered them as dhimmis, right? They considered them as dhimmis, not as equals. So Sachar, as you will read in this week's excerpt, seems to be making the argument that perhaps the Jews should have foregone British support, British assistance, and they should have trusted the future of the Zionist movement and the Jews of Palestine to the Arab elites. As you read the paragraphs where he talks about it, ask yourself if you believe, as he is trying to point to that as a possibility, if you believe yourself that could have worked out. Whether that could have worked out long term, short term, ask yourself, had you yourself been a leader of the Jewish community there at the time, what would have been your decision? What would you have risked? Would you have risked everything on that proposal, or would you have, gone with what they decided? Again, it's like every of those decisions, right, are going to, it's a domino that falls towards, the almost the unavoidability of conflict, right? The Arabs not deciding to join in a Samuel government, and have a democratic interfaith government in Israel. The Zionists saying no to the Arab proposal to bypass British rules and work together for the greatest good of all. Would you have believed that? Would you have risked it all, to in the interest of, maybe being able to have peace, to foster relationships? I will let you wrestle with those questions as you read. Now, keep in mind, as we've seen, I think, last session, that the British pre-mandate, so between 1918 and 1922, this earliest years, there was a military presence, right, in the land. And there was a military administration, right? And if you remember, I mentioned that military administration was pretty anti-Zionist, right? And so even though the Arab elite will see the British Empire, as the arm of Zionism, both Britain Christians and Arab Muslims were united in the opposition to Zionism. So, keep that in mind as well as we start talking about these challenging issues. Scholars disagree, meaning that they offer different possibilities and different alternatives, but they disagree, that's what we can say, as to the birth of Arab Palestinian nationalism. You will read this week, you will read next week. There is really never any mention, even through the 30s, of anyone calling themselves Palestinians. Everybody calls themselves Arabs or Jews or Christians or Muslims of Palestine, but there is no notion of anyone calling themselves Palestinian, right? There is any notion of that, at least so far as we've gone. And next session we'll talk about the 1930s. There is no one calling himself Palestinian. That does not exist yet, okay? And there is still Arab nationalism and Arab nationalism of Palestine. There are some historians like Sacha who point to the founding of post-World War I Muslim Christian associations in several Arab towns that were created to protest the future Jewish national home as the earliest organizations of Arab nationalist action, political organization in Palestine. When Faisal became king of Syria at first in March of 2020, the Arabs of Palestine called for their union with his nationalistic kingdom, right? They called for becoming Syrian under his rule because they felt that his rule was born out of a Arab nationalist consciousness, which is what it was, right? Because his father Hussein had promoted pan-Arab nationalism and wanted to create one pan-Arab state in the Middle East, if you remember. So, his son Faisal is carrying that torch. So the Arabs of Palestine are seeing him as a nationalist leader for the Arabs, and they ask to be integrated in his nationalist kingdom, right? Because again, there is no local consciousness of Palestinian nationalism, but there is a consciousness of Arab nationalism that is being born after the Second World War. And it's in December of 2020 that there is a convention of all Muslim and Christian associations, the one that was just born after the war, that is gathered in that December at the end of 1920. Did I say 2020? No, it was 1920. Let's not jump a century ahead. And that big convention of all of these Muslim Christian associations, again, we say Muslim and Christians, but the umbrella is Arab, because you can have Arab Muslims and Arab Christians, as you can have Arab Jews. My family's origins are of Arab Jews. That convention in December of 1920 takes place in Haifa. And really, it's essentially the first Palestine Arab Congress. Just like Herzl had the first Zionist Congress in 1897, in December of 1920 is the first Palestine Arab Congress. And this Congress' main demand was that Britain install an Arab national government in Palestine. The convention elected an Arab executive body that will, in fact, as we will see, relentlessly, endlessly oppose both the British mandate and the Jewish national home. Now, I'm still, the camera is still on the Arab history, right? In the 100 years that preceded the fall of the Ottoman empires, I was talking about the Arab elite, where there were two main families that were the elite of the elite, if you like. And these two Arab families who for 100 years were, like I mentioned before, the families that were the ruling on behalf of the Ottoman Empire in the land of Palestine. These two Arab families had competed for 100 years for primacy and leadership in the local Ottoman administration. And after World War I and the end of the Ottoman Empire, they were the two families that sought to take over this emerging Palestinian nationalistic movement. I shouldn't say Palestinian, this Arab nationalistic movement in Palestine. That's more precise. These two families are the Husseini and the Nashashibi. Husseini on one hand, Nashashibi on the other hand, right? Now, the word Palestinian, though, interestingly enough, the word Palestinian begins to appear thanks to an Arabic Christian newspaper. Why? Because Arab Christians have always called the land, because they're Christian, by its, let's say, Christian name, right? It really was a Roman name, but then it was adopted by Christianity, that when Christianity took over Rome, the Christian name Palestine. So actually the name Palestine is not a Muslim name, right? It actually comes, well, all the way from the Philistines. So it's always ironic that the Philistines are the first nation that the Israelites defeated in their unifying their kingdom under Saul, and then King David. King David, who defeats Goliath. Goliath is a Philistine soldier. So it's always interesting. So that name, the Philistine, is adopted by Rome after the defeat. The Jews, they thought they were, putting a dagger in their heart by calling the land after the name of their first opponent, that probably didn't know or didn't remember that it was, yes, the first opponent, but it was the opponent we defeated, and that through defeating that opponent, we unified as a nation, as a people. Anyways, doesn't matter. The Christian closed this parenthesis inside the other parenthesis. This newspaper names itself Philistine, Palestine. And that's how the name catches on in the Arab Muslim world as well. So close that parenthesis also. In May 1921, I know I'm sharing a ton, but I'm really trying. I'm really trying to really set everything as clearly as possible. What's going on for the Muslims, for the Arabs? I think it's, we need to dedicate that time to that as well, if we want to understand the unfolding of history. So we're still dealing with the Arab of Palestine right now. In May 1921, just after the Jaffa riots, High Commissioner Herbert Samuel appointed Hajj Amin al-Husseini to the most important Sunni Muslim position, that of Mufti of Jerusalem. Notice what Samuel did. He picked exclusively of his own. Nobody forced him. In fact, there were some kind of fake elections where the Husseini family ended up being fourth in the election. Samuel disregards the elections altogether, and he one-sidedly appoints Hajj Amin al-Husseini as the Mufti of Jerusalem, ignoring not just not just the election that just took place, and completely voiding what had just happened, but also ignoring the other family, um, that of the Nashashibi. And that's going to be problematic. But that's what happened. Again, another domino is tipped over. When Hajj Amin al-Husseini is put in position of Mufti of Jerusalem, understand that doesn't just mean the city of Jerusalem, but in fact, if you look at one of the maps that I gave you, it's the entire vilayet of Jerusalem. So it's really, actually, it's not called a vilayet in this instance. It's called, I'm not going to pronounce it correctly, but Mutasarriflik, a Mutasarriflik, the Mutasarriflik of Jerusalem, which basically is the entire land of west of the Jordan, Palestine. Right. So to be the Mufti of Jerusalem means that you're the Mufti of that entire region of the Arab world. Hajj Amin was a fierce Palestinian nationalist. And I really want to insist on the word fierce. It was greatly feared by the Jewish leadership, which, together with Samuel halting all Jewish immigration for a few months after the riots, which marked the end of Samuel's Zionist's honeymoon period. But by appointing him, by Samuel appointing him to that position, Samuel just created a time bomb, as we will see that Hajj Amin would become the most devastating foe of the Zionist movement throughout the British Mandate, stirring up great anti-Jewish violence. Almost immediately after Samuel's term ends, and he leaves Jerusalem back to London. But the Arab opposition to any collaboration with the Jews made it so that both communities developed separately, as I mentioned, unwilling as they were to participate in any joint political system. And Hajj Amin will build his power base so much so on this opposition to the British rule, to the Zionist movement, that he was elected, ensured that he would be elected leader of the Supreme Muslim Council in 1922. The Supreme Muslim Council was created to be kind of the counterpoint of the Sanhedrin, the rabbinic council, basically, of the Zionist movement, right? So basically, in doing so, Husseini is now both, right? There's no separation of church and state anymore, basically. He's the Mufti, and is also the supreme leader of the Muslim Council. And now the Husseini family has a complete monopoly on the nationalistic movement of Arab Palestine. And that, of course, created great resentment in the Nashashibi family, who, in fact, secretly reached out to the Zionist leadership, in a more, ready to be conciliatory, but at the same time, publicly, they sided with the Husseini family to oppose Zionism, to oppose the Balfour Declaration, to oppose any political system that could incorporate Jews, into any kind of configuration. And nonetheless, knowing that the Nashashibi could not openly in Arab court voice their support or voice their antagonism against the Husseini family, the Zionist leadership continued to reach out and even to fund the Nashashibis who opposed the violence that the Husseinis had espoused against the Jewish population. But as we saw, the Arab population is growing very rapidly. The Jews not as much, and so Hajj Amin and his nationalistic movement in the 1920s are growing less and less afraid of the Zionists. Right? They're like, it looks like it's the end of them. They're not growing in any significant way. We, on the other hand, are growing leaps and bounds. There's less fear of them. Perhaps that also explains why there is this period of calm for 8 years between 1921 and 1929. But in 1929, the end of quiet ends violently. In 1929, major anti-Jewish violence explodes again in the land. And you will read about all of that in great details in the readings that I have assigned for this session. I'm just gonna share some highlights to kind of wrap up this session today. By the end of 1928, Hajj Amin began to verbally attack religious Jews in Jerusalem Old City for having erected a screen to separate men and women at the Western Wall. Now, those of you who have been in Israel or have seen pictures of the Western Wall, there's this large esplanade where you can gather Jews by the thousand to pray at the Western Wall. That only takes place in the last, say, 40, 50 years. Before that, there was the Western Wall, and the Western Wall was there was a very narrow streets in the old city of Jerusalem. On one side, you would have homes, apartments, little homes. On the other side, the Western Wall, right? The wall of the old temple of Jerusalem. So it was a very narrow space. But there was a concession that the Jews could come in a certain spot in this Western Wall to pray. And there must have been a reason, a holiday or whatever, but religiously you're supposed to separate men and women. And that actually also is the case in Islam. And so the Jewish leadership came and had a little fence probably that they put so that both men and women, religious, everybody was pretty much Orthodox, could pray at the wall. When that happens, there is so much anger that is being, forced upon the Jews by the Mufti that he and his followers descended on the Jews at the wall to disrupt their prayers, to harass them, and even go as far as burning their prayer books. And now Hajj Amin goes further and starts to spread rumors that the Jews were about to take over the Temple Mount. Rumors follow calumnies follow accusations of all kinds, and all of that comes to a head several months later. Like Hajj Amin really built it up over months, and on August 23rd, 2029, the Arab mobs descended on the defenseless ultra-Orthodox religious Jews of Jerusalem. And in the wake of that, it spread to the other holy cities of the land. Major attacks in Hebron, major attacks in Safed, Tiberias, and other places. And once again, the British forces did nothing to intervene. And so, like in 1920 for Nebi Musa, the Arab police joins the rioters. Not only did they sympathize with the rioters, they also didn't want to be caught being caught beating up or even killing an Arab brother. And so they joined in the protest. In Jerusalem, the Haganah, the early Jewish defense organizations, was mightily effective at protecting the Jews. But the worst of the attacks took place in the ultra-Orthodox towns of Hebron and of Safed, where Jews and Arabs were actual neighbors to this day. And the horror visited on the Jews of Hebron really left the community in utter ruins. And again, all the gory details can be found in the reading of this week. The conclusion from these horrendous riots was that this was by and large a Husseini-led attack. The Nashashibis were afraid of Arab public opinion that supported the Mufti, and so they went along. The Arab Christian community, though instrumental in promoting Haj Amin's anti-Jewish propaganda, the Christian community did not participate in the riots themselves. And according to what I have read, mostly really because the propaganda of the Mufti that sparked this violence and these riots was based on defending the Muslim holy sites, right? The Jews were going to take over the Temple Mount, and so the Christian didn't really feel invited or included in the propaganda. And just as the Christians sat that one out, so did the Druze population. And that was really noted by the Jews of the land. Like even more than the Christian, who, even though they didn't participate through their publications, through their newspapers, they really supported the propaganda itself. The Druze did not, right? And so the Jewish community really noticed that, and it really sparked the beginning of deep and friendly relations between the Jews and the Druze populations in the land. And in fact, we'll see that these relations will continue to expand during the 1930s, to the point where the Druze population, they're only like 1% at the time, will eventually fight alongside the Israelis during the War of Independence in 1948. And to this day, the Druze join and serve and are really revered as incredible soldiers in the Israeli Defense Forces, in the IDF, in the Israeli army. Okay, I think that's enough for this session. I think that was a lot of information. Let me see if you have shared some questions. I guess either it was completely overwhelming or I was absolutely crystal clear. But I hope I was able to do as honest a job as I could do at this stage, to peer into the Arab communities and its unfolding and the birth of its own nationalism, and who came to lead. I think it's very important for us to understand that there really is there is the leadership of the Arab population, and there is the Arab population, and oftentimes the two really don't really meet. And the elite is really good at rallying the masses, but they're really rallying them around their own agenda, around their own vision, around their own, you know, um, their own goals. I don't think they, especially in these early years, they ever pull their people to see, what do you want? What do you want us to do on your behalf? Right? I don't think that ever happens. And so that's the kind of leadership that that is going to lead this Arab nationalistic movement with Hajj Amin Husseini. Again, another domino, right? Would Samuel had appointed someone else, maybe from the Shashibi family, would that have made a difference? We will never know, right? But he appointed probably the leader that would be, or was already at the time, the fiercest opponent to the Jews in the land. So, talk about setting the scene for conflict. It's quite fascinating to watch. All right, so we talked a lot about many things today. The third Aliyah, the fourth Aliyah, the emergence of Arab nationalism in Palestine. I think we can see how that is all going to unravel when we meet next time. We're going to close, as always, with a Shalom chant, inviting you to close your eyes and take a few breaths. And if you so choose, to join me for a threefold Shalom chant. Thank you all. We'll see you next time.
Yeah. You should get yourself a job as a teacher.
Oh, all right. I'll give it some thought.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Modéani.
Thank you.
Thank you.